Hi, everyone. I'm Jamie Haft, Executive Director of Circles USA, here to introduce our first webinar in a 2020 Big View series, and the topic is Civic Engagement 101. The Circles method combines direct services with systemic change. And when chapters join the network, we ask for a bold commitment to reduce poverty in 10% of the county in 10 years, reducing the poverty rates by 10%. As our families experiencing poverty work their plans to reach economic security, we convene them to hear about the systemic barriers that are impeding their progress. And we created this mental model to show what it looks like when a community is managing the symptoms of poverty instead of actually truly reducing poverty. So in a poverty management system, government and community-based organizations push resources down into the system, and we offer services in relationships that feel transactional, and the outcomes produced are random, short-term, and unreliable. As opposed to a true poverty reduction system where the services are more seamless and they're integrated across all 5 stages of self-sufficiency, from crisis intervention to stabilization, readiness, placement, and advancement. And so at Circles USA, we're advocating to shift from a poverty management system to creating a true poverty reduction system. At Circles, we call our systemic change work the Big View. And together, we're developing and promoting a national agenda for ending poverty. An election year brings a focus on public policy, and so we have a unique opportunity to scale up Big View efforts in the community and to work together to bring attention to our shared mission of ending poverty. At the last Circles Leadership Conference in Greenville, South Carolina, Joan Kuriansky and Lisa Doyle Parsons hosted a Big View session with chapters, and they asked us for key resources to come out of the headquarters. We were asked to put on webinars about civic engagement, and particularly how chapters as 501c3 organizations could still promote voter education and voter turnout and could interact with all candidates for public office to ensure that we're promoting a mission of ending poverty. We were also asked for newsletters and resources that highlight how chapters are already doing Big View work on key issues like affordable housing, the cliff effect, transportation, and more. And finally, we were asked for an articulation of Circles USA's thought leadership on our anti-poverty agenda. What are the public policies and system gaps and service barriers that could be fixed so we can better support our circle leaders that are working so hard to move from poverty to prosperity? So we're calling all of these activities that we'll be doing in 2020 our nonpartisan civic participation campaign, and this civic engagement webinar is the launch. We're excited for our 70+ chapters to deepen their work locally and statewide, and for all of us to work together to raise visibility for our mission of ending poverty. And we're aspiring to reach even more communities, trying to get to a tipping point of 10% so that we're in 300 counties to gain widespread commitment that we can and should end poverty. So to launch our Big View series, I'm so grateful that Amy Basken, a volunteer with Circles Sauk Prairie in Wisconsin, has offered to share with us her professional expertise and introduce Civic Engagement 101. Thank you so much, Amy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been working in the space of advocacy since 2005 when my youngest child was born with congenital heart disease. And I have been actively working in federal legislation, state legislation, and local policy to advance initiatives in this space. And one of the roadblocks we've hit is that social determinants of health is a huge factor in outcomes for congenital heart disease. So imagine my excitement when I have the opportunity to now overlap my personal passion, my work, with the efforts that Circles is doing. So it was very easy for me to quickly raise my hand and say, I want to help with this initiative. Advocacy happens at many levels. Today's presentation, we're going to talk about what you as an individual can do. And then in future conversations, we'll talk more about what your chapter can do and what Circles is doing nationally regarding the policy initiatives. But first we need to start with the why. People tend to be a little nervous about advocacy, but it's absolutely at the core of nonprofit work. It advances your mission. It's actually legal, so don't worry about concerns about the legality of advocating, and we'll talk about some boundaries that you can keep in mind to help be comfortable in that space. But it's also encouraged. Right? You as an individual have a story to tell, and combine that with some facts and data, it really matters, and you can accomplish great things. Oops, now I can't advance my slides. Oh, there we go. Advocacy takes on a lot of forms. You are probably already advocating within your own home in order to get your own needs met, or advocating for the needs of your children. You're advocating in your community, whether it's interacting with the school systems. Circles works with local businesses and with banks, financial institutions, and also with government. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about interacting with government in policy ways, but know that all of this can be applied to advocacy at all of these different levels. To think about advocacy and be a little more comfortable with it, and it's not this big scary enigma, think about it as building relationships. What you're doing is you're sharing your story, adding it to the facts in order to move somebody else into action. And if you think about when you're a little kid and you want your parents to do something, you have to convince them about why it's important. And that's essentially what we're doing with our legislators and our lawmakers. By staying focused on education and being really clear about the mission of the organization and the issue at hand, you can safely stay within the boundaries of lobbying. You cross over into lobbying when you mention very specific legislation that you want them to vote on or make a decision about. But when it comes to general ideas, like we care about affordable housing, we care about access to healthy nutrition, we care about the cliff effect, and you can describe those issues in great length without ever crossing into any boundaries of lobbying. The other thing to stay cognizant of is bipartisanism. We can't favor one opinion over the other. We can't favor one legislator over another based on their voting records. We really need to be inclusive of all of our lawmakers and all of our policymakers. So if you're going to educate one policymaker, it's a good idea to share that same information across the board with everybody. So keeping that in mind, advocacy is absolutely encouraged. So I wanted to share the story that I heard about Jenna in Utah. It's a perfect example about how a single individual, really embraced her story, knew her challenges with lack of affordable housing because she experienced it. And what she did by sharing her story with other policymakers, she testified at different legislative events. She inspired a whole community to take action. She not only inspired others in her situation to share their own experience, but she inspired the leaders to do something about it. And I think that's the crux of it, to build that community, but to inspire change within the change agents. So if you're in the lived experience of being a circle leader, I imagine life is pretty overwhelming, and you can get lost in the details of your own story and not understand its importance to other people. Your stories, your experiences, they matter. And by talking and sharing with people outside of your personal circle, you can influence change. At Circles, I'm just going to read some of these mission pillars that we believe sustainable social change comes from the bottom up, right? It's based on individuals. Individual members of the community make a long-term commitment to such change and compel leaders and institutions to take action. We believe that those experiencing poverty, you guys are the experts in designing these community-wide solutions. So we need to empower those people who are the experts and allow them to communicate the important message that they have. And this is an old African proverb, but it's so true, especially if you live in Wisconsin, where I'm from. Mosquitoes can be pesky, and they're tiny little things that can create a large ruckus. So don't ever underestimate yourself and the power you have as an individual. And here's some examples of the wonderful stories that can arise out of the Circles program. So we're going to talk next a little bit more is about building these relationships. The basis of relationship building is to get connected. You need to spend time with that person, communicating and interacting. And we'll talk about some strategies for doing that. You need to work through conflicts. When you're communicating your message, it's important to understand that the other person might be feeling differently. And so you need to look at how you can create bridges instead of burning down and burning bridges. Find that common ground, share those interests, and really build that relationship. It matters that the individual goes to their policymakers, and here are just some quotes that we've heard from our policymakers. They don't hear from home enough, especially those that are in DC. It may seem like they're getting barraged with information all the time, but not really the true personal stories. We've moved to the age of automatic robo-letters. So the more that you can send personalized communication, the better off you are at building those relationships. We have the power to hold them accountable, and we'll talk about that with the voting piece a little bit today, but then I think more in conversations to come. And larger organizations can go and storm the Hill. They can hire, million-dollar lobbyists to have conversations in closed offices, but your personal story really does matter. In fact, 97% of congressional staff in Washington, D.C. say that in-person visits from constituents do make a difference. 88% say that personalized emails also make a difference, and we'll talk about how to do that as well. All right, so let's just talk policy for a little bit. I threw in some information just to give you just a general background. If you're interested in learning more, there's several resources we can tap into and share with you. Basically, to know that there's a lot of people who can help influence change. We've got 2 senators and 1 representative at the federal level. Their leadership and their terms are staggered, so building a relationship is often easier with senators. They're there for a longer amount of time. The representatives, however, represent a smaller number of people, so it's sometimes easier to build a personal relationship with them because they don't have as many constituents coming and barraging them. Our state government is very individualized. It's remarkable how each state is different from another in how their representatives are structured, what geographic regions they cover, but also when and how long they're in office. So it's important to take some time, if you're interested in state advocacy, to really know how your own government works. There's also state agencies and actual federal agencies too that you can influence as well, whether it's the Department of Health or the housing agencies, so that you don't necessarily have to be talking with your elected officials. And then again, the same with the local government. The structures vary even more for local governments and how your representatives support you and interact with you. So there are opportunities to influence, and I just wanted to bring these to your attention so that you understand. Most people think of, well, all I can do is change a law or get a law written. But in fact, that's sometimes the hardest thing to do. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of laws introduced every year, and just a small percentage of them ever actually get passed. And by asking a member of Congress to support a specific bill, like bill number HR 122, that's actually lobbying. So that crosses over a little bit into the space for consideration when it comes to the lobbying laws for a nonprofit. So you can educate folks and say, pay attention to laws that have to do in general with housing, and here's why. But when you get to a specific piece of legislation, you need to be careful. The law then is what gets written and passed and put into the formal ledger, but then it has to get implemented once the law has been passed, and that is done through regulations. Regulations help describe the standards and rules that allow the law to be carried out. We can talk about, as a nonprofit, the regulations all we want. We can identify specific words in the regulations that we like or don't like. It's much easier to talk and influence the regulation development than it is with the laws. So just keep that in mind. The other thing is the money associated with these laws and regulations. And this at the federal level happens through the appropriations process. At the state level, it also can happen through the budget development. That's another place that people don't think about that they can influence. You can actually suggest language that you want incorporated into the regulations and to the laws through the appropriations process. So just keep that in mind, that most people, when they think about going to Congress, their policymakers, both at the federal and the state level, they think about just changing a law or writing a new law, but there are amazing opportunities through the regulations process, through appropriations funding, and then through agency work that we can have influence. I put this in here too because one of the big misconceptions is that if you don't have the ear of your particular lawmaker, nothing is going to happen. And that may be true in the smaller government settings, like in your local area, and sometimes with our state government, but the staff people are so incredibly important. I seriously was in a Senate meeting when we were talking about obesity on the playground, and my senator turned to his staff member and said, "How do I feel about that issue?" It's the staff people who have the ear of the members of Congress, the staff people who do all the research, the staff people who then help inform the decision of the lawmaker. So please don't underestimate the power of the staff people in communicating with them. They're young, they look like they just graduated, but they are smart as whips. All right, the how. How can we make a difference? There are lots of different platforms which have really evolved over time. When I first started, the only way you could communicate with your member of Congress in Washington, D.C. was to send a fax. Thankfully, that's changed because that's often a challenge to find a fax machine right now. Social media has become an easy way to interact. It's a little less personal, but we'll talk about some ways to do that. Emailing is great. There's robo-email forms on websites, but then there's also a way to make a personal connection. Making a phone call helps, and we'll talk about a couple options for doing that. Mustering up all your courage and doing in-person, face-to-face meetings, there is nothing like that. Whether you do it in your own backyard, with your local government or state government, or you meet the staff of your members of Congress in the in-district offices. That's another great way. Or even traveling to Washington, D.C. and sharing your story with your legislators there. In-person visits is a really powerful way to do that. And an extension of that is inviting folks to a local event. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So since we are doing okay on time, I will break some of this down. Don't feel like you need to copy it all down. The slides will be made available. On the different social media platforms, there's some different actions you can take. Something from as simple as just a like or a tweet to actually commenting and trying to engage them in a conversation through virtual Q&A opportunities and commenting on posts. Again, comfort level can depend on how deep you'd like to get engaged, but the further you're willing to go to engage in that conversation in a constructive way, the better the relationship will be over time. So again, I mentioned the two forms of email. There's the robo emails, which are you can complete using an online form on all the members of Congress's website, especially at the federal level. I'm pretty sure it's the same with the state now. It's a great way to do it, but again, it's a mass email. It's not considered spam. They do look at it, they record the contact, but it's not personal. You can send a direct email. Again, this is where the staff I find is important. You can call the office and ask for the email of the staff person who handles issues on housing or handles loan repayments. And then they will direct you to the right staff person, give you that email address, and you can send a more personal direct email to the staff in charge. And again, this ends up being more influential. It allows you to include attachments. We encourage people to send photos of your lived experience, of your loved ones, just because it adds that personal touch. How and when to send emails. I didn't include that here, but I think it's important to send emails frequently. I tend to do it once every 2 to 3 months to help propel that relationship. If you're a circle leader, share your progress with how things are moving on the issue that's important. If you're concerned about housing, how are things moving? Share your experiences with them, update them on your progress. If you've engaged your children, give them updates on how your kids are doing, because that's important that they see the impact of the work that you're doing with them. Calling the office, again, there's 2 different routes to do that. Absolutely calling the office to weigh in on something is very important. I have seen the notebooks that sit at the front desk, and they will take your name, write it down, let you know, and they do give that report to the members of Congress or to the staff who's responsible for that issue. So I do think it's great. Again, I think a personal contact, if you have the name of the staff person that's handling your issue, calling them directly, and having an engagement or a check-in every once in a while is as important as an email. Sometimes I think email is more efficient, and I know that the staff people respond to those more quickly than they do to a phone call, but it's still important to consider that as an option. Again, this was written to promote the visits to DC, but you can also build those relationships right in your backyard. Local governments, we talked about advocating with local agencies, local resources, whether it's businesses or financial institutions. Just going and making eye contact and sharing that story can break down so many walls and make people vulnerable and open to the change that we're asking them to make. I just wanted to highlight a few important things just to know that Circles can help. Circles can help support you with making those first communications, helping you in DC if you want to schedule some appointments, if you happen to be traveling there for some reason. Circles can give you the talking points and leave behind documents for the legislator or staff member. And, you know, we can also coordinate, I'm kind of being bold with that statement, that will go with you. But we can certainly look at what the opportunities are to support you in that way as well. Just some key timing for visits, especially for our federal folks, but I think this is true for our state elected officials as well. There are large recesses in August for federal government and throughout the year for state that it's not recess like we get to play on the playground. They actually leave DC or leave the state capitol and are working from the district. So that's a good time if you plan ahead to set up a meeting, and you might be able to catch your member of Congress. It's also a great time if you host an event during that time period. They're more likely to be available to attend during the recess time period, as well as during their campaign trips. So because this is an election year, there will be a large chunk of time in October as well, where at least our federal elected officials will be campaigning, and that's another good time to try to engage them either with a meeting or by inviting them to attend either. I mean, it could be as simple as a Circles meal. Just engage them in what you're doing on a weekly basis. You don't need to create anything special. Just have them come and experience it. Or, as we'll talk about, you can create a forum to have a more structured engagement with multiple members of Congress. Oh, I think we already covered this. The other key component is voting. I mean, voting, if I can't stress it enough, voting is a huge extension of your voice. I love this quote from the League of Women Voters: "The right to vote is a fundamental principle of our democracy." When more of us participate, the outcomes better reflect who we are. And if we don't vote, we don't really have an option to complain or be concerned, because that is our key to communicating what's important to us. We encourage you to do your research, make your opinions count. By doing your research, you can be informed, you can help educate others. It's important to make sure that your research is also bipartisan. I think social media allows us to stay in these little bubbles and see things from one side rather than getting down into the true underlying nature of the issue. If you need help with research or it's making you anxious, please don't hesitate to reach out, and we can talk to you about how to better navigate the issue landscape. And then working with your candidates and understanding what's important to them, I think, is a great way to build that foundational relationship. Knowing what their platform is, where are they starting from, so that you can meet them in the middle. I have to tell you, I met one of our candidates at a public festival held in our town. We do this really weird thing where we throw cow poop. So it was a cow chip festival, and our senator came as part of his campaign trip, and we had a brief conversation right before we went to use the hand gel, and that conversation stuck. I was able to work with him throughout the campaign, as I did with all my representatives, because we had to remain bipartisan. Once he got elected, we had his ear, and it was very easy to continue the dialogue and helped with the future passage of a law. But it started very, very early. We started that relationship before he was ever in office, and it paid off dividends. Planting seeds early paid off dividends in the end. Just a reminder to plan ahead. I know voter registration deadlines are coming up, so if you haven't registered, please do encourage others around you to register. Know when those voting dates are. Local government is just as important as your state and national elections. As a Circle team, figure out where your polling places are based on where you live. It's possible to preview the ballot online, so you can look that up. And then it's also helpful to know if you can vote absentee or participate in early voting. If getting to the polls is an obstacle for you or someone that you know, there are options to make it a little bit easier to participate in the voting process. This link, which again will be available, is another great resource to help understand how you can be the best voter that you can be. On election day, it's a team effort. Getting out the vote seems like a campaign slogan kind of, but it's so important. If your neighbor has difficulty with transportation, help them get there. Encourage your friends and family. Social media is a great way where people show their stickers and say, I voted. You don't have to tell people who or what you voted for, but you can encourage people to participate in that process. And then just remember to make sure you follow the rules of your local voting place, that you bring your ID, that you are already registered, or whatever needs to happen at your local voting poll center. So this is a big year because it is an election year, and so there's a lot of scuttle, there's a lot of opportunities to influence change through the vote. So again, re-emphasizing that just voting matters. That this is a huge opportunity to set up those early meetings with the candidates and with those who are incumbents and running for office. They want to hear from you. They are campaigning. So if you have a great story, they want to hear that and use that as part of their feel-good messaging. And they're really, really trying to earn your votes, and they know that you matter. So this is a great time to engage with that process. But it's also important to know that business is not always as usual, and it's important to look at the calendars and to navigate that process as well. Just to stress, people often will not know just to put one foot forward and start with the advocacy process. Knowing that your story matters should compel you to move forward. It's just important. Advocacy is important. And I believe that is what we have today. Oh, a little bit more about telling your story. We'll keep going. Communicating is important, right? You're trying to build these relationships, and oftentimes our story could be an entire book. And I hear that a lot. Oh my gosh, everything I've been through, it'll take me years to tell you. It's important to work on the messaging and make it nice and concise. And that can be difficult. So it's important. So think first about, if your issue is housing, how does your story, what are the nuggets from your story that relate specifically to housing, and pull those out. Focus on 3 key elements of your story. Introduction, telling the elected official why you matter to them. I can vote for you. I live in the same town. I live in your state. I know that you care about housing. Let's talk more about housing. So that's the introduction. The key message, this is where I wouldn't worry so much about facts and details. Tell your story. Describe why housing matters to you, why the cliff effect matters. And then always have that little bit of tweak of what you want them to do. You're trying to move them into action, and if you don't tell them what you need to do, then it's just a really nice story. And if you're unclear about exactly what the issue is, that's totally fine. We can help clarify that for you. But even just saying support things that help people move to end poverty is a great ask, and that way that'll be on their mind as those issues arise. I'm not going to go through all of these, but know that as you're developing and practicing your story, there are some tips to keep in mind that'll help you be the best communicator that you can. Again, just breathe. It's okay to be anxious, it's okay to be nervous, but know that what you're doing matters and it's making a difference. You don't have to be the expert in the policy, you are the expert in the experience. And just know it matters and you're making a difference. And then lastly, whether you interact through social media or write an email or go vote, it's important that you follow up. Building a relationship, sometimes it takes 7 touches in order to move somebody to change, or even just to remember something. So it's these interactions over time that can help build that relationship and help move the policymaker into making the necessary changes. And that is where we will end. And I am open to questions. We can go back here.
Amy?
Yes.
This is Gina. We have one person who, oh, now all of a sudden it disappeared. One person who says, I know regulations have a comment period. Do laws also have a comment period?
That's a great question. Not necessarily. What laws have is a committee period and then a Senate review or like a larger review period. So there is a period when the law is passed and housed in a committee where the members, the policymakers have the opportunity to discuss it. And sometimes at that point, they will hold a hearing, a public hearing. And when the hearing takes place, then you can come and testify at the hearing. Oftentimes, the members of Congress and the bill authors will identify specific individuals to sit at the table and share their larger story. But there is sometimes a public comment period where you can stand up to the microphone and share then. But there's a way to indirectly be contributing. So if your elected official is part of one of these committees, you can have this open conversation with your elected official and say, you're responsible for this bill that's coming through. Let's talk about this issue and why it matters to me. So you can't necessarily comment on the specific legislation because you're jumping into the lobbying space, but you can talk about the issue and bridge that gap and say, look, I know that this issue is important. I know that this bill is coming up. Let me tell you why it matters to me.
Thanks. Let's see, there's another, this one's kind of a long one, so bear with me. A state committee is currently considering a bill that will allow predatory lenders to significantly increase interest rates. Must we avoid saying the name of the bill if we send correspondence to all committee members?
I think people will fluctuate on this, and I am not, a disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a paid lobbyist. So my understanding based on my experience is that you can reference the bill, you cannot direct them to vote either way. So you could reference this bill and say, this is why it matters to me. But when you say vote in favor of or vote opposed, you are then foraying into the lobbying space. Now, it's not a problem to be in that lobbying space. It's just my understanding, and the laws may have changed in the last 18 months since I've looked at it, but my understanding is you need to note how many times a volunteer interacts with a member of Congress about a specific piece of legislation. So I would say, again, being on the safe side, you can communicate about the bill and about the issue, but I wouldn't direct them to vote either way.
All right, and one more. This person says, I am an immigrant, not a US citizen or permanent resident. Does my voice matter? Do
Absolutely.
I need to do things differently compared to citizens?
Your story absolutely matters. The only reason I'm pausing is because there are some issues when it comes to you being an official constituent who can vote, but I think you can still share your story and let them know why it matters and why, even as an immigrant, this is your experience and your interaction with our country, and that should matter to your policymaker. I know of a few folks who have citizenship of another country who have joined us in Washington, D.C., and just don't tell people that they're not from the US. So that's another option, is to not disclose that part of your background. But yeah, I think telling your story and engaging with the system is essential.
Thank you. Anybody else have a comment or a question? If you'll write it in the questions box or the chat box, that would be great. Jamie, you're muted.
As you're thinking about your questions, I'll pop on again and say thank you so much, Amy, for providing this context that chapters have been asking us for. And we're going to share this recording to those chapters that couldn't be part of this, because they said that some of our coordinators and coaches said that even if there was a webinar that they could share with their community, share with their circle leaders, it could help them amp up their big view efforts. And so what's to come with our series is that next month's webinar, we're going to unpack for you what would it look like to host all candidates for an event, a candidates forum, where circle leaders and community members could share their experiences of an issue, and all policy makers and those running for office could be invited to join. And then toward the summer, we're going to start focusing on particular issues. We did a membership survey of all the chapters to find out about their existing big view efforts and what issues are most of concern. And we heard from you that you want more resources on the cliff effect, on trauma-informed care, on affordable housing, and more issues. And so we're going to then go deep and focus on stories from the chapters about how to tackle these key issues. And finally, we're going to be producing materials like a Circles USA policy agenda for ending poverty with key fact sheets on particular issues that you can use in your community. And I want to thank and acknowledge those members of our Big View Advisory Committee, Amy, Joan Kuryansky, Lisa Doyle Parsons, and Lynette Fields, and invite you, if you'd like to roll up your sleeves and be part of the planning of this 2020 nonpartisan civic participation campaign. We would love to have more volunteers. Any other questions, Gina?
Yes, there's one more. It says, I can see how staff need to be careful about asking a legislator to support or oppose a particular bill, but why are volunteers bound by this?
Great question. If you are not representing circles, I would imagine you're not bound by this. But I was just reviewing and preparing for this webinar, and there was some guidance that suggested volunteer hours towards direct lobbying also need to be counted. I will admit that this probably would benefit from some legal counsel, so I can look into this further and give you a more informed answer in the future.
All right. And the same person says, and I think they're missing a word. Also, as staff, we can advocate for particular bills or issues, but do we have requirements on reporting that?
Yes. So that, again, we can look into that. And as part of the National Big View team, I will charge us all to take a look at that in more detail so we can provide stronger guidance for you.
Okay. I'll copy that and put it in an email, Amy.
Perfect. Yeah, it's a little bit challenging because the guidance is very, very vague, and it just really depends on how you define certain terms. So we need to decide as a team what's important to our organization. So it'll just require a couple more conversations, and then we can help provide better guidance.
Okay. And it looks like, let's see. Oh, her corrected comment is, but we do have to abide by reporting requirements. Gotcha. Thanks. And then the last one that I see, what can you do differently when interacting with a representative whose publicly known position is generally not aligned with the point?
Take a deep breath and smile. Kill them with kindness or lead with love is another thing we try to tell people. I would not let it prevent you from having that interaction, because you may be able, through relationship building, find the opportunity to find where there is a personal connection. Sometimes there are philosophical social beliefs that they just will not bend on. And we've found that there are just some places you just kind of have to just smile and say thank you for your time. I have had an experience where there was a member of Congress who was not politically aligned with what we were asking them to do. And he said, I can't vote on this bill. I can't support this bill publicly, but I happen to be on this committee, so I will help make sure at least it gets out of committee. I'll do what I can behind the scenes. So there are some ways that maybe they can compromise and help support your cause, support the specific issue, even if they can't publicly vote or comment.
And then from Utah, this comment says, all of the ideas that Jamie just brought up would be amazing to have available. A meeting with legislators would be great, but maybe we could have an online forum like this for those of us that live a long way from our state capital.
Absolutely.
Great idea.
And you will also find, we can talk more about this in an extended conversation, but even if your state folks will do tours of the state, so it is possible to meet with them closer to home. They'll often do a town hall in a library or something like that, offering the opportunity to interact. So we can walk through some of those opportunities too.
All right. Any other questions? Well, from the panel side of things, this was a great webinar. The interest, the attentive ratings were really high, and something that everybody seemed to be really on the edge of their seat for. So thanks to the Big View folks for putting this out.
Well, and if I can say thanks again for the opportunity, I am so thrilled to see the interest and passion in advocacy, and hopefully we can encourage more and more of the folks in our communities to get involved to whatever degree they're comfortable with, but to grow those relationships.
Thanks so much, Amy, for sharing your expertise with us. And thanks all for joining and being so attentive. And we'll share the recording. We'll follow up in our monthly Big View newsletter at the end of the month, and we'll be back in March with another Big View webinar.
Then I'll throw out, if you are interested in participating in the Big View committee, this is Gina. Send me an email and I'll get you connected to the next meeting. All right, are we wrapping up?
Yes, indeed. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.